All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Crystal Garcia, and I'm the content coordinator here at TASA. Thank you again for joining us for our first webinar of 2025. Today, we are going to be observing Human Trafficking Awareness Month. It is the last day of the month, but we are so grateful that TASA can offer resources and learning opportunities year-round. So we will actually be studying and learning with our very own staff today. So we're really glad to have Mike Sweeney, our criminal justice analyst and our human trafficking specialist here on staff at TASA, joining us for this great webinar. I know it's widely requested for training and conferences around the state. So so glad that we could offer this to y'all this morning. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started with Mike's content today. This session is being recorded for our YouTube channel. We usually make that available within about 2 weeks of the recording. As long as there's no technical difficulties or anything like that, you can follow us on that channel and subscribe and be able to see the recording whenever you want and share it whenever you want. This session will also be eligible for 2 hours of continuing education credit. We will send those certificates after the end of our session. We usually get those out in our follow-up email about 10 business days after the session's over. In that email, you will get the follow-up email with a reminder to do the training evaluation if you don't get that completed today, and the certificate of completion, which is the same as the CEU certificate, and access to the recording. So as well as Mike's slides. Those also are going to be made available to y'all after today's session. If you don't get that email within about a week or week and a half, feel free to send me that directly. The email does go out to quite a few people, and so sometimes it ends up in junk or spam or socials or unfocused emails. All of our emails look a little different these days, and they do that great work of filtering for us, but sometimes because it's going to so many people, it may get lost in the shuffle. So please feel free to send me an email and just say, hey, Crystal, can you resend that to me? Absolutely, no problem. And that's it. We are going to be allowing people to utilize their microphones to interact with Mike today. We will keep your cameras off. However, we do respectfully request that you please keep those on mute, especially with private or confidential conversations that could be happening in the office. We don't want to accidentally capture those for all the rest of us to be able to hear. So leave those microphones on mute if you're not interacting with the panelists. If we have to come back in and mute, it also mutes our speakers. So just help us out with that. And then if you do want to interact with with Mike today, Peggy and I are here to monitor the chat. We have the Q&A box going, as well as the chat box where y'all can ask questions or let us know anything you might need through today's session. So with that, I will turn it over to Mike and we can get started.
Good morning. Happy late New Year, but New Year none the same. I kind of look like Father Time issuing in the new year, but we'll get started. Thank you all for attending. I see some names that I recognize. Let me get my screen back here. Is that it? Or are you still on green? Do you have the slide, Crystal?
It's on yours. I think that's coming from your computer. So you may have to stop sharing and reshare it again for some reason. And I know I'm seeing in the chat a lot of people saying we don't have microphones. You do not have that yet. I have to go in and manually give all of you permission. So those are not enabled yet. So if you'll just be patient with me, we have about 90 microphones we got to enable. We go by alphabetical order.
So Mike, it's really switching back and forth between that gray screen and your slide.
Okay, let me reshare.
Now I'm not seeing the slide.
Okay. We good now?
Yes, but it's not in a slideshow review. We see your slides down the left-hand side.
Still?
Yes.
Hmm.
There we go.
Better?
Yes.
Awesome. All right, we'll get rocking along here. All right, a little bit about TASA for those that aren't familiar. TASA is a statewide advocacy organization. We work to address and eliminate sexual violence through public policy, which is a team I'm currently on, training, which is a team I was on previously, through our prevention work, and we have our legal as well. On the training team, we provide assistance and training to first responders, sexual assault service providers, and members of the community to improve services to our survivors of sexual assault, bringing expertise from all sorts of organizations, law enforcement, public health, advocacy. TASA is a unifying voice to eliminate sexual violence in Texas. A little bit about myself. I am with TASA. I'm on the policy team at the moment. I'm a criminal justice analyst. So we review all the bills that are being filed currently. It's a madhouse because we're starting our session. So there's literally hundreds of bills coming in that we review. Anything to do with sexual assault, human trafficking, we review those, support them or don't support them. Oftentimes we testify, we go to the Capitol and testify in support of bills that we feel best service our survivors of sexual assault. My history, 30-year plus law enforcement veteran. I'm going to skip through this for time. Just a general, this presentation is about a 3-hour presentation that I'm trying to shrink to an hour and a half. So it's kind of like going to be drinking water from a fire hydrant. We're going to go fast and furious, but please stop me if you have any questions, and we'll have time at the end for questions as well. I started my career in Aurora, Colorado in 1984. I realize some of you probably weren't even born yet. I spent a couple years in uniform, and it's funny. My history and my resume, if you will, is a prelude. And isn't it funny how our lives and things that we do prepare us or direct us in where we are and what we become, right? So throughout my career, even as a young police officer in training, we had through the FTO field training program, we had to go through a report and check off certain things. So many domestic violence, so many DUIs, so forth, different types of calls. In going through that period, I logged more sexual assault initial investigation first responses than I did any other crime, the DUIs or any other crime that I responded to. And through that, it gave me an appreciation for survivors of sexual assault. Spent about 2 years on the road, 3 years on the road. In the academy, they parade all the special units through to show you kind of what they do. And the narcotics team came through, And man, I just knew that was it. I wanted to be a narcotics detective and work vice and narcotics. I mean, they had all the cool stuff. Even back in 1987, we had cell phones and we had pagers. And granted, the cell phones were about the size of a shoebox, but we had equipment and things that nobody else had. Listening devices. We did special investigations. So as I started along that career path, um, my focus was on interview and interrogation, and I was just obsessed with it. Aurora, Colorado is a very progressive department, and I was fortunate that they provided a lot of training for us, sent me all over the country, focusing on interview and interrogation. I'm sorry, was there somebody speaking? All right, so I stayed there for about 18 years. Focus again on narcotics and vice, right? Which is we worked prostitution stings. We didn't call it human trafficking back then, but that's very much what it is. It kind of changed over the years, and we worked human trafficking. I recall in the late 80s, the early 90s. Our team, we did an investigation of buying a 9-year-old little girl for the purpose of sex. She was being sold by her uncle, and we did undercover work, and we ended up arresting him. Again, right? That's human trafficking. It's been around a long time. It's still here. It's still going strong. And it's just funny how those things started way back in my career, right? So in 1998, I relocated to the Mississippi Gulf Coast and joined the Ocean Springs Department and rose through the ranks and ended up becoming chief of investigations there. Again, furthering my own personal development in interview and interrogation, behavior analysis of suspects and predators throughout my career there. Something very interesting happened in 2005. A lady came to visit. Her name was Katrina, and she decimated the Mississippi Gulf Coast, all of the Gulf Coast. We heard a lot about Louisiana and New Orleans. Mississippi Gulf Coast wasn't just flooded, it was destroyed. And when that came in, it was like when the storm was over, walking out into a third world country, right? Things that used to be there, the 7-Eleven on the corner, they were gone. They were no longer in existence. We had an apartment complex, about 220 apartments in it, reduced to the slab, the concrete slab. It was gone, right? Mass destruction, mass casualties that occurred during Katrina. During that time, people came from all over the country to help us get through that, right? And there was this lady that came from Ohio. She was very short, had a really funny accent from way up north. She came to see the chief, and of course, the chief was way too busy to speak with her, and he sent her to me. She was a chaplain, and I sat and I had a long conversation with her, and she started telling me about the neurobiology of trauma, and she was telling me what was going to happen to the men and women of my police department within the first few weeks, within the first few months, within the next 5 years. And I found it fascinating. And those things that she was telling me came to fruition. They happened, right? Some of the trauma, the things that we saw were just devastating. Mississippi Gulf Coast flooded. My police department was elevated. It kind of sat up on a hill from the Gulf. My police department was one of the only working 911 stations throughout the whole Mississippi Gulf Coast, from Louisiana to Alabama. So what happens in 911 situations If you call and your local 911 can't respond, those numbers keep rolling over, rolling over, rolling over until they find an open 911 communication system, right? So my dispatchers were receiving 911 calls from the entire Mississippi Gulf Coast. And these people were in danger, right? They were up in their attics. People were drowning within their own homes, on their own rooftops, right? Can you imagine the trauma of these dispatchers, my dispatchers, that were on the phone with these people as they're actually drowning, right? They're going underwater. And eventually the cell phone system got overloaded and went down as well. We had no communication with our adjoining departments. It was reduced back to like Civil War days. If I wanted to communicate with Biloxi Police Department, I couldn't call them. I couldn't get them on the radio. I'd have to send a runner, which in normal circumstances would have been over a bridge, maybe a 10-minute drive. They would have to drive all the way inland, up and around, and it would take an hour for them to even physically get there, right, to convey a message. So it was very difficult, and the trauma was just amazing. And some of the things that this chaplain expressed to me was that over the early on stages, you'd see increases in substance abuse, alcohol, drugs, right? Prescription drug, uh, illegal drugs. You would see increased instances of domestic violence within your own police department. You would see instances of divorce. You would see instances of eventually suicide. All of those things became a reality over the next 5 years, right? As a result of trauma. And what it fascinated me that that this took place, right? And then I learned that trauma is trauma is trauma is trauma. Whether you're in a hurricane like Katrina or in a house fire or like the fires that are currently happening in California, right? Or the devastation of the hurricanes in Carolina, South Carolina, um, or you're being sexually assaulted, or you're being trafficked. The way the neurobiology of trauma works and the chemical reactions in the body and the reaction on the mind, trauma is trauma is trauma. They affect us all the same. Um, in police work, we receive direct trauma, right? Often involved in officer involved shootings. Um, Secondary trauma from dealing all the trauma that they deal with on multiple calls every day, right? And all of those symptoms occur within law enforcement too. And what I soon became to realize was it shouldn't be such a stretch for us in law enforcement. I know we have several here, and you are my heart, right? But we experience trauma. We experience the symptoms of trauma. So do our victims and our survivors of sexual assault. So it shouldn't be such a big stretch for us to have empathy and to understand our survivors, right, of sexual assault. After Katrina, I became a critical incident stress managed counselor, or CISM. Um, so after officer involved shootings or horrendous crime scenes, um, we would do debriefings, and it's been found that um, critical incident stress debriefings kind of help derail some of the post-traumatic stress syndrome that occurs if we can attack that earlier and get attention to that. I became that. I was a professional standards, internal affairs, training coordinator. In 2008, I was fortunate enough to be selected to go to the FBI National Academy. And again, there I furthered my obsession with interview interrogation and behavior analysis. Behavior analysis is the profiling, if you will, of suspects and perpetrators, and specifically focused on those of sexual assault and human trafficking while I was there. Was the accreditation manager, director of a Jackson County, Mississippi multi-agency training facility. I went back in 2011 was a master trainer for National Alliance of Chaplains Corps. That little lady with the really strange accent from up north in Ohio, I went to work with her and trained nationally, training chaplains about neurobiology of trauma and how it affects police officers and how they could better focus on the needs of police officers suffering from the trauma, right? So in 2013, I came to TASA. I traveled the great nation of Texas from north to south, east to west, training on various sexual assault investigations, primarily focused in law enforcement, but drug facilitated, stranger, non-stranger, and also trauma-focused interviewing, and interrogation of sexual assault suspects. So I traveled all over the great state of Texas doing that. In 2014, I became the director of investigations for a company called IJM, International Justice Missions. A very good friend of mine, and you'll see a picture of him shortly. We were partners for a very long time throughout my career in vice and narcotics. He and his wife went to work for IJM, and they called me and they said, "Hey, we have an opening in Ghana, Africa, investigating child labor trafficking, and we think you'd be a perfect fit for it." And at first I was thinking, man, Africa, I didn't lose anything in Africa. I really don't want to go to Africa. But after I went and I interviewed and they showed me videos, horrendous trafficking going on with very small children, kids from age 5, 6 to 17 years old. They were being taken from the beach area, the southern area of Ghana, where fishing was traditional, right? Fishing families, and they take these children from their homes up north to Lake Volta. Lake Volta is the largest man-made lake in the world, right? We did prevalence studies out there. It was like, honestly, like being on the ocean. You couldn't see land in either direction once you got out in the middle of it. And they take these small children and force them to fish for tilapia. These kids would work 16, 18 hours a day. They would eat once a day. They were afforded no medical attention. They weren't allowed to go to school. Many of them suffered from disease, malaria, bilharzia. Many of them had crippling injuries that had never healed correctly from not getting medical attention. These kids would be forced to dive down into the water and untangle nets that were used to catch the tilapia. And many of them would die, right? These kids were taken from their mothers, often sold by their mothers to the traffickers. The mothers would have 4 or 5 children, and they would sell one of their children to the traffickers so that they could provide for their other children, maybe send that child to school or just to simply feed them, right? It was an economic problem. And of course, the traffickers would tell their kids, tell the moms that, yeah, we're going to use him. We'll bring him back in a couple of years. That never happened, right? Once they were gone, and they were abused by the traffickers. So I did that for about 3 years. The first 18 months, we spent doing prevalence studies, doing extensive undercover work. Even myself as an old white guy, with the help of an interpreter, I stole several detectives from the National Police Department because I could pay them better, and trained them in human trafficking as well. And so we go out on the lake and we did hundreds of hours of documentation of these kids being trafficked, right? The government received millions of dollars from the United States in tip money. trafficking in persons money. The problem is that money never made it down to, they had a human trafficking task force, but that money never got there, right? They didn't have cars. They certainly didn't have boats. And it was the position of the government that this wasn't trafficking, that it was an apprenticeship. They were teaching these children a trade, right? How to fish. It was by no means that, right? It was forced labor. So by hours of video and showing the extent of the abuse, the broken bones, the disease, the situation, after about 18 months and several political regime changes within the police department and within the country, we were able to get in there and really start training and facilitating with the human trafficking task force and start seeing some results. We would go out on the lake and we would do raids, right? We'd go out and target specific areas that we'd probed and knew that there was trafficking going on. And we would go out and attempt to rescue these children and identify the traffickers, the boat masters, they call them, and arrest them and get them prosecuted. So it was interesting, though, that as we approach these boats in an undercover capacity, we would wave, we would bring candy, they call it toffee. These children in the boats that were being trafficked were naked. If they had clothes on, they were badly soiled, way too big, holes just draped over them. And we're talking about the African sun, right? Right near the equator. It's brutal. The kids suffered burns from the sun, malnutrition. Their hair was burnt. Instead of being a rich, healthy black hair, it turned almost to a rust colored from malnutrition and from the heat and the sun. We'd approach these boats and we'd offer candy or a soccer ball, football, right? The traffic kids would immediately look to the trafficker as if to say, is it okay? Can I take this candy? If the trafficker's child was on the boat, number one, he was dressed very well. Number two, he was greedy and would grab all the candy, right? He didn't have to ask his parent, the trafficker. He would just take. The other kids would not move, would not speak unless given permission by the boat trafficker, right? The trafficker. Same thing happens in our country today, right? We have young people being trafficked, boys and girls, and the traffickers exert that same control, and we'll go over that as we go on. But interesting things. These children, as we approach them and talk to them, as we rescued them, they were just little vacant shells of a person, right? You could look in their eyes and there was just no light in it. There was no life there, right? We'd rescue them. Oftentimes the boat masters would tell them that if the police come, you need to run because they're going to eat you. And they meant literally eat you. And these kids, when we go to rescue them, they'd flee, right? They'd jump off the boats, they'd swim to land, they'd run up in the bush, they'd fight with us. They had this allegiance, this trauma bond with the boatmaster, right? They call him daddy. And the same thing happens in our trafficking in the US, right? Something I found interesting was that they do things much differently there. We had aftercare. We had three pillars, right? We had law enforcement that we did the investigation, we went out and did the rescues, and immediately, excuse me, after the rescue, we turn them over to aftercare. And aftercare would do a wonderful job. They would get them clothes, and it was an amazing transformation after about 3 days of working with advocates and aftercare. These vacant shells of children would start to come to life, right? you'd start seeing little boys and they'd start fighting with each other and they'd start playing soccer, football. And they'd start coming back, and it was very visual, and you could see the transformation. Aftercare would take over the investigation. We would not work with the survivors at all at that point once they were handed, which was immediate. We'd take them off the trafficker's boat, take them to an aftercare boat, large boat, and turn them over, and we didn't talk to them anymore, right? So aftercare would find out where they came from, who their family was, and relay that information to the law enforcement. And then we would go follow up, arrest the traffickers, look into their family situation, and try and reunite them with some type of community. It wouldn't be the parent that sold them, but a grandparent or a part of their extended family to get them back into the community, right? So it took us 18 months to get that far. In the next 18 months, we rescued about 85 children, arrested, I don't know, I think it was about 20 boat masters, traffickers, and educated the prosecutors, educated the judges on trafficking, on neurobiology of trauma, and helping them with the victims. We educated their advocacy, right? Their aftercare on trauma-focused intervention, right? Because you don't know what you don't know. So we helped them all the way through the process, and then started getting finally some good prosecutions, right? Believe it or not, that's me on the left. I did have hair. My undercover identity was that of a biker. Did a lot of narcotics investigations, a lot of human trafficking investigations. That individual on the right was my partner, Bill Heller. He was married to his wife, Mary, who become important a little later on as well. And they're the ones that got me into international justice missions and doing the trafficking investigations overseas. 30 years of law enforcement. I'm an Irish cop. My father was an Irish cop. My language may tend to slip. Sometimes it'll be intentional in a quote of a survivor. Sometimes I'm very passionate about this subject, and sometimes it will slip. I apologize in advance. I can promise you, you might hear an F-bomb. I usually, if I have a partner that I present with, we usually have bets about who's going to drop that F-bomb first. Usually it was my partner, Kim Farbo. She was worse than I am, and I'd get a free lunch out of the deal. But warning on that. Also, as we start to delve into this, trigger warnings. Very possible that someone within this audience was trafficked. More possible that somebody within this audience has been a survivor of sexual assault. At any time, if this gets too heavy for you, please feel free, right, to excuse yourself. Do what you need to do to take care of yourself. I'm sure that if you feel maybe that you need some counseling, if you'll private message Crystal or Peggy, we can arrange that for you as well, right? But I want to make sure that you take care of yourselves. Pretty crazy. I like the music. Um, Average cost of a slave, $90. I can tell you it's less than that. Having worked literally hundreds of human trafficking investigations as an undercover myself, or going after the traffickers, the pimps, working what we called op johns, where we would have our undercovers go out and work the streets and johns, right? Those looking for sex workers would come and they would interact and do deals. We would literally arrest a hundred customers, Johns, a day in those stings that we set up. It was nothing to do that, right? Um, it is equal now. It showed it as the top 3 black market issues, right? It's equal with narcotics now. Far more than gun running. And the reason is that if you think about it, I worked drugs for a long time, some very, very complex, high profile investigations. If I sell an ounce of cocaine, a kilo of cocaine, right? Part of that money that I get back, I have to go to resupply. I have to get more cocaine to sell. If I'm selling a human being, as long as I keep that human being fairly healthy, I can sell that human being, that commodity, right, over and over and over and over again without ever having to re-up. So it's a much more lucrative endeavor for the traffickers, right? Even more so than the drug dealers. And right now, human trafficking, sex trafficking is right up there equal with drug trafficking. Here are some statistics. This study was done by the University of Texas. I think, and I know I saw Priscilla on the registrar. I don't know if she's showed up, but this study was done, I think it started in like 2016, 2017, came out in like 2018, 2019. The most comprehensive and current study on trafficking in the state of Texas, right? Some of those numbers, 79,000 minors and youth victims of sex trafficking in Texas, 234,000 workers victims of labor trafficking. Currently, 313,000 victims of trafficking, human trafficking in the state of Texas. Traffickers exploit $600 million from their victim in labor trafficking in Texas, right? It's incredible the money that they make in this endeavor, right? What's human trafficking? Modern day slavery by exploitation. The 3 key pillars of trafficking: force, fraud, and coercion. It's in every statute. It's in every city statute, state, federal, and world, right? Force, fraud, and coercion. Those are the pillars of trafficking. There's sex trafficking, forced or bonded labor, kind of what I was doing in Ghana, what goes on in our agriculture industry, many other industries. There's domestic servitude. Well, they'll bring someone in, usually an immigrant from a different country. They'll withhold their papers. What starts out as doing house services, right, turns into sexual slavery. Agricultural, they'll bring them in as landscapers. They don't pay them. They don't feed them. They withhold their paperwork, their identification. That's domestic servitude. So the fraud, force, and coercion. Let's look at that. Force, I think we know what that is, right? The beatings, burning, branding, tattooing. Drug addiction's huge. If I get you drug addicted, I own you because you're going to depend on me for those drugs. Confinement, seasoning, or it's grooming them, and sexual assault. Far more, and force is important, right? It's an important pillar, element of trafficking, but it usually comes later on. What you find is the fraud is the recruiting tool, right? Those false promises of marriage, that deceitful, enticing, affectionate behavior. I'll be your boyfriend. I'll take care of you. I'll be your daddy. that enticement, that fraud of bringing him in, that misrepresentation of conditions, that promise of a better life, right, of something better. We talked about withholding wages, that coercion, threat or serious harm, emotional abuse, control of their daily lives, that brainwashing, right? We're going to talk a little bit more about that. Threats to family members. That fraud brings them in. The force and coercion keeps them in, right? Any person under the age of 18 in a commercial sexual act can be anything of value, right? If I trade you my gold ring for oral sex, it's a commercial sex act. If I trade you a Big Mac for a sexual service, that's commercial sex act, right? Maybe I offer you, you're a runaway and I offer you a nice place to stay on my couch instead of out in the open in exchange for sex. That is commercial sexual exploitation, right? Human trafficking is an international issue. It affects all genders, races, ages. 20 to 30 million in slavery globally. 50% of those are children. 19% are forced or bonded labor, agricultural, mining, fishing, right? 80% are sex trafficked. Huge number, huge number. 600,000 trafficked across international borders yearly. 1,700 or 17,500 trafficked into the United States every year. That's not counting our own individuals, people that are present here being trafficked, but people trafficked into the United States. An estimated 1.5 million trafficked individuals in the United States, and that trafficking occurs California, Texas, Florida. Why do you think that is, right? Those states, why do you think they're the leaders of trafficking throughout the country, right? They're commercial port or they're ports of entry into our country, and they're funneled through those states and through our highway system. It's interesting the relationship between narcotics and trafficking. They use many of the same routes to smuggle their drugs that they do traffic individuals across the United States. They move them around to avoid detection by law enforcement as well. So the average age of a sex trafficking survivor is 12 to 14 years old. Out of every 3 victims, 2 will be female, 1 will be male. There are many, many more males being trafficked than you would like to believe, or that are brought to the people's attention. It happens quite frequently, almost as much as female, but not quite. They come from all socioeconomic and cultural backgrounds. Most common from lower socioeconomic background or those vulnerable populations, right? They target those, and we're going to find out how and why and what lends to that, right? I didn't mention victimology is the study of victims, right? So in the study of victims, it gives us insight and clarity as to what the perpetrators are looking for, what they're going after. Gives us great insight, not only to the survivor and how we can better serve the survivor, but also into the perpetrators as well, right? So here are the vulnerable populations. Runaways, particularly a runaway from social services, right? Homes. Why do you think that is, right? Why do you think that is? For you to end up being taken from your family and put in a foster home, something really bad had to happen, right? For them to pull you from the family unit and put you in another location, either with foster parents, right? 60% more likely they are apt to be trafficked than normal runaways or the other endangered population. And it's because of that trauma that they've already experienced, and we'll go in depth into that. Drug or alcohol addiction, talked about that a little bit. If I get you drug addicted, I own you because you're going to come back to me for that drug and you're going to need to facilitate that addiction, right? LGBTQ plus, why would you think they're a vulnerable population, right? Oftentimes they're forced out of their family unit or their community, right? They're ostracized. They also suffer a high amount of polyvictimization. We're going to talk about that. Is victimization from many sources, right? And it almost, that trauma almost preconditions them and puts a flag on them for the predator. The predators start looking for those flags and those behaviors, right? I've spent over 30 years learning to be a profiler, to be behavior analysis. And these traffickers, these predators have it innately. They can see that wounded individual and they go after them, right? That applies persons with disabilities, homeless, mentally ill, sex workers, elderly, immigrants, documented and undocumented, right? They see it. They see the vulnerability and they attack that. And they use fraud, deception, eventually force and coercion to keep them into the trafficking game, right? If you get nothing out of this webinar, the next couple of slides I want you to really focus on, right? So 5 basic human emotional needs. I didn't learn this in a textbook or a psychology class. I learned this as an interrogator through the FBI Academy, right? So we all have these. Every breathing, living human being on the face of the earth has these needs. We have that need for safety, the control over our own life, the need to be accepted, to belong, to be loved, that need for recognition, to be respected, and that need for economic well-being, right? To be able to survive, eat, drink, and be merry. We all have those basic needs, right? So what happens, and we all have 2 of them, by the way. One is a priority, a primary, and the other is a secondary, right? So mine, like I'm real big on safety because of what I've gone through in my life. I need to know that I'm safe in whatever environment I'm moving around in. I need to be loved and accepted, right? Most people do, right? So if we have this child, and I know many of you are parents and probably grandparents, if I'm not showing my son, daughter, grandchildren that they are loved, it creates a void. It creates a void in their soul, in the deepest inner part of their being. And they're going to fill that void one way or another, right? If I'm not feeling it, if I'm not fulfilling that child's need, someone else is going to come along and do that. And it more than likely is not going to be good, right? And the predators see this and know that. That's that red flag I was talking about. They see that and they target them, and in comes the deception, that fraud, right? Oh, you're so beautiful. You should be a model. You have such a beautiful voice. I have a friend that is in the recording industry. I can get you hooked up with that, and we can go to Vegas and you can make lots of money. Doing that, right? They play off these needs, whatever that is. Now, in my world of interrogation, I look at these and I try to identify them in a suspect, and I can leverage those needs to gain a confession, right? So let's talk, we talked a little bit about it, polyvictimization. Poly is many, victimization, many victimizations, kind of like polyticks, many blood-sucking, irritating insects, right? I'm not much for politics or politicians, but polyvictimization, that many over and over victimizations of an individual, polyvictimization. They experience emotional abuse by caregivers, assault, harassment by peers, sexual victimization by acquaintances and strangers. They're exposed to crime and violence in their communities, in their neighborhood in general, right? I mean, they're growing up and they're walking out and they're seeing the sex trafficking going on. They're seeing the drug abuse going on. They're seeing domestic violence in their home, on the street, right? Those are all victimizations. Uh, uh, CCRC study found that 10% of children in the US, in the nation, reported 4 or more different kinds of victimization within a single year, right? So what happens with these poly victims is they have extremely high levels of traumatic stress syndrome, right? PTSS. Physical abuse, bullying, they account for considerable portions of association between these individual victims and traumatic post-traumatic stress syndrome, right? Which is interesting. You hear this okay, Crystal?
You know, you're 12 years old and you're living with your moms, and your mom's is struggling because she didn't think that life was really going to work out like this for her, and she doesn't have a man around, and the men that are around haven't always been that great. Sexual abuse is becoming kind of normal for you, and you think that other people don't have secrets that are as bad as you, and maybe you've tried to talk to somebody at school and they haven't really heard you, or maybe they just haven't had time to listen to you. And so you're seeing these girls on the videos, and they're so pretty and they're so sexy, and so your way at 12 of escaping into this fantasy world is to think about what it must be like to be one of these girls, and you know that adult men already look at you, and you wonder how you can kind of use that.
I was just a child, and that's how I was supposed to live, like a child and like an adult.
So one day you're coming out of school and there's a guy outside in a Cadillac, and he's nice looking. I mean, he's got the baseball cap and the jeans and the Timbs, and he tells you how pretty you are and you know how pretty your hair looks, and it's been a while since anybody even really noticed anything about you. And for the first time, you feel like somebody's really interested in you, because now all of a sudden he's asking you about your dreams and your hopes and where your father's at, and he says that he can be a daddy to you.
The people that I shouldn't have depended on, I was depending on for support.
And so that night he takes you to a club and he puts you up on the stage and he gives you a few drinks, and there's men throwing dollars at you, and it's scary, but all the time you're just looking at his face in the back of the room, and he's like, you know, go ahead baby girl, go ahead, you're doing it for daddy. And you're feeling proud because nobody's ever said that to you. And so then that night he tells you that there's more stuff that you've got to do, and he takes you into a room and there's a man there, and he tells you to strip, and you think this is something you'll never do, and yet there's a part of you that already knew how to do this, because that's what your stepfather's been doing to you all these years before. And so you turn that trick, and it's like a part of you has died inside. And so you come out of the club that night and you get in the car, and you know he's pumping 50 Cent, and he takes you to McDonald's and he tells you, you did a good job tonight, sweetie, and he's stuffing his pockets with the $1,000 that he made, and right now you're happy.
The people that I shouldn't have depended on, I was depending on for support.
and you feel like this is the best that it's ever going to get, and everything else in your life has prepared you for this moment. All the sexual abuse, or the neglect, or the drama, or the pain, or the trauma has prepared you for tonight, where you stepped across a line that you always thought you'd never really quite step across. And you don't realize that night what it'll be like to be on the track and get raped. And you don't realize that daddy isn't really going to protect you. You don't realize what it's like to have a gun held to your head that night. You don't realize what it's going to be like when you catch your first STD. You don't realize what it's going to be like when you first come home and daddy beats you for the first time because you didn't make enough money. You don't know what it's going to be like to have cops offer to trade sex with you in exchange for not being arrested. And then sometimes you'll do that and they'll still lock you up anyway. You don't know what it's like to sit up in jail and know that you just made $1,500 for your pimp last night, but he won't come down and put $200 bail on just to get you out a few days early. You don't know what it's like to walk down the street at 6 o'clock in the morning when you're just getting off work and people are starting their day and they see you and they know what you do and they look at you in a way that you just don't feel like you belong in that world anymore. And you don't know what it's like to feel like you've lost part of yourself along the way and to feel like you'll never leave. And no matter how many times you try to leave, he'll always find you and catch you. But that night, all you care about is the fact you're riding in a Cadillac and you're eating McDonald's and you're listening to 50 and you got this one man who you really think loves you sitting right by your side.
We're going to look at some of the trauma symptoms, and I'm just going to pull a few of these out. If I had time, we'd go through all of them, right? But interesting, right? Did you see some of the things in that video? 80 to 90% have had prior sexual abuse, right? 80 to 90%. Interesting. So those symptoms cause trauma, right? And the neurobiology of trauma, we start seeing these symptoms here, right? That fear, that anxiety, that rage, right? Who are they angry at? Who are they angry at? Us. When we go to try and help them, if I go to interview them, if I try to intervene and get them out, it's focused on me, right? Depression, the mood, guilt, and shame. You heard her talk about walking down the street early in the morning while everybody else is going to work and she's coming home, and how they looked at her and how she felt like they knew, right? They just knew who she was and what she did. And she just didn't feel a part of that world, right? Emotional numbness. This is our brain on trauma, very scattered. Intrusive symptoms, excuse me, re-experiencing that trauma, right? Troublesome memories, flashbacks caused by the reminder of the traumatic events, reoccurring nightmares, the dissociative reliving of that trauma, right? They have phobias of places, right? I went to a trafficking symposium in Nacogdoches, and they aired a video on human trafficking, and they had a survivor that did a documentary on it, and she was talking about her experiences, and they had the camera person going behind them, and a reporter, and she's documenting this as she goes, and she goes by a townhome that she used to be trafficked out of, and that it happened to be vacant and it happened to be open, right? And she and the crew went inside there, and she's walking through this townhome, and she's saying, yeah, here's where I fell down the stairs and broke my arm, compounded. And you can see and hear in her voice that as she's going through this, she's reliving it, right? It's like it just happened. She's reliving that. That happens to our survivors of sexual assault and of trafficking. Law enforcement, oftentimes we want them to take us to the place where it happened in search of evidence and documentation, right? But we have to be empathetic, knowing that revisiting these places causes great trauma for that individual. And we have to be patient. And if they're not able to do it at this moment, this space and time, right? If they're not in that place, give them some grace, right? And understand why they can't. And it affects us all that way, right? I remember I was involved in an officer-involved shooting and in a certain part of town. And after that event, every time I got a call in that particular neighborhood, that block, it disturbed me so bad. I would pull my gun out of my holster and lay it on my lap, right? Just to make it faster in case something happened. That's trauma, right? That's the effect of trauma. It took me forever to get over that particular location where the shooting took place. Same thing happens with our survivor, right? Chronicle signs including sleep problems, trouble concentrating, irritability, anger, again, who? Us. That poor concentration, blackouts, difficulty remembering things, increased startle response, hypervigilant, right? Any of those things, do you think any of those things are conducive to an intake form for an advocate or for an interview as a detective or a police officer going out and trying to, trouble concentrating, blackouts, difficulty remembering things, right? I do a training on trauma-focused interviewing that helps overcome some of these barriers that gets us more accurate information from the survivors and does it in a trauma-focused way, right? Victim-centered, so that I'm not re-traumatizing them, is one of the classes that I teach. Emotional numbing, that lack of interest in activities that used to be enjoyed, that emotional deadness, distancing themselves from people that they love or used to hang out with, that sense of foreshortened future, right? We like to think of ourselves as heroes and protectors, and I'm coming in to save you. And when we come into these traffickers' lives, they don't want that, right? Our mere presence and our mere interference, especially for sex traffic victims, they're more than likely, if the pimp knows, sees, hears about their interaction with the police, they're going to receive a beating or they're going to be sexually assaulted just by our interactions, right? And they have the sense of that foreshortened future, and we're in there trying to help them and asking them questions. They couldn't care less, right? They're trying to survive that moment, that experience with that John, that customer, that pimp, right? They don't see a future. They don't see hope. They're trying to get by that moment, right? And we have to take that into account when we're dealing with them. And our intentions are good, but we have to understand where they're coming from, that they really don't give a flip, right, about helping you. They're interested in what happens, what's going on right now. That's it, right? So if we can think about it that way when we interview, when we do intake, when we go to provide our services, it'll give us some insight into how to better service those survivors. What else was interesting, before I go into this? Law enforcement, and well, all of us, social services, we've done ourselves a great disservice over the decades, right? We spent decades teaching our kids, teaching young people about stranger danger. Don't talk to strangers, don't hang out with strangers, don't give your personal information to strangers. When the whole time we should have been talking about Uncle Mikey danger, right? Because the ones we know, trust, and love are more often, the ones that hurt us, right? When I do a homicide investigation or law enforcement does, we start in a very narrow circle of influence, right? We start in that immediate home, that immediate household, those immediate contacts. And we start eliminating people within there, and we work our way out as we go, right? Same thing happens with trafficking. It's those ones we know, we trust, and often love that hurt us. Do stranger abductions and things like that happen? They do. Very rare, probably 20% of the time. Most of the time, it's someone that survivor knew, trusted, and thought they loved that harms them the most, that gets them into trafficking, right? And they do it by manipulating those five needs that we have, right? All of these symptoms of PTSS, the regulation of fleeing, suicidal thoughts, explosive anger, passive aggressive behaviors. Those are all things for the survivor to overcome, for us to be aware of so that we can better provide services or interview, right, or do our investigations. But they're also things that the traffickers see, recognize, and target to go after their victims and recruit them as well. That persisting feeling of shame, helplessness, guilt, you heard it on that video. She felt everybody knew what she was doing, right? The feeling that the perpetrator of the trauma is all powerful. You heard her say that he knows, right? He knows where I am, who I'm talking to all the time. Sometimes they do, right? They track him. Sometimes it's a vast network, right? You have all the other, I'm going to use girls as an example. Boys are trafficked too. But you have all these other girls. Typically, a trafficker will have 8 different women that he's trafficking, right? So they snitch on each other. If she's talking to another pimp, another trafficker, one of them will narc her out, or he may see, or he may hear from another trafficker that she's talking to somebody, right? Or talking to the police. And it gives that perception to the survivor that they're omnipotent, that they're everywhere, right? And what happens with that, they end up with a preoccupation of revenge against the trafficker or allegiance to. Most often it's allegiance to the trafficker, right? We call that trauma bonding. It's a traumatic bonding because that trafficker is supplying her with all the drugs she needs, all the food she needs, the clothes that she wears. He's convinced her, fraud, right, that he's her daddy, her lover, and that he'll take care of her, right? So there's some intersections that go on with human trafficking, domestic violence, and sexual assault. In domestic violence, how many times typically will a survivor of domestic violence leave their significant other before they're done with that relationship? I can't see the chat, but I'm sure some of you probably know that. On average, it's 7 times. That abused individual will leave that relationship 7 different times before they finally put an end to it. The same thing happens with trafficked individuals, right? And it's frustrating. It's frustrating to our advocates and social services. It's very frustrating for us as investigators, detectives, and police, right? We do all we can. And again, we think we're riding in on our white horse to save them, and they don't want to be saved, right? They just want to survive. And they end up going back to their trafficker. What I try and do is establish a relationship with them, an honest, trustworthy relationship, that if that individual leaves their trafficker and they report to me and I take that information, by treating him as a human being with respect and dignity, I hope that when they do it again, they come back to me again, because they're very valuable, right? Of course, as a human, and it's a process that they go through to get out. And even as much as I want to make my case on the trafficker, I would rather have that survivor be away from the trafficking, off of the circuit, right, and be made whole than making that case. I want to make that case, but I'll never make that case unless I treat that survivor with dignity and respect, right, and empathy, and let her or him know that you can trust me, right? I understand what's going on, and eventually, what I try and do is go from that allegiance where they're bonded to the trafficker to that revenge against, right? I try and point out things like, what clothes do you own? Typically, they might have a pair of jeans, cutoffs, flip-flops, and a t-shirt. When they're arrested, they have nice clothes, but those are all furnished by the trafficker and shared with at least 8 other trafficking survivors, right? Within the same place. They own nothing, literally nothing. So I make comparisons. Well, what does daddy have? Oh, man, daddy drives that nice Cadillac Escalade and lives in that nice house. I bet he's got a nice PlayStation. What do you have? Right? And I'm trying to bring to light that light bulb, that epiphany to go off to get them to understand that they're being used, right? And it's a process that takes a long time, and it takes trust for that to happen. They suffer a severe change in those things that give them meaning, loss of spiritual faith, that separation again. And that's by design too. I mean, trauma does that. Trauma makes those things happen, but the trafficker enhances it, right? He doesn't want you hanging out with friends and family, right? Definitely doesn't want you going to church or functions that you're around a lot of other people. He wants total control of what's going on. So he enhances, again, the effects of this post-traumatic stress, right? What are some of the health issues? AIDS, HIV, other sexually transmitted infections. Hearing loss, why would that be? I mean, unless you're being labor trafficked in a commercial industry type of a situation where there's loud noise going on. But sex trafficking victims experience hearing of loss because they get smacked upside the head, right? The traffickers are very careful to take care of that commodity. And trust me, that's all the survivors are to them. It's about money, right? How pretty your face is, how much money he can make off you. He's not going to scar up your face, break your nose. They may towards the end, and there's different types of pimps. But generally speaking, they try to keep that commodity healthy and attractive so that they make more money, right? You'll see skeletal injuries, drug addiction. We talked about that. If I get you drug addicted, I own you. Mental health issues. We used to say that life expectancy once you came into the life, right? Once you became a sex trafficking victim was about 13 years. There's really nothing to back that up. It drastically reduces your life expectancy. Of all the sex workers that we came in contact with, you would see them when they first came out, right on the track, on the streets, and we would photograph them in contacts or patrol officers when they would see a new sex worker out on the street. They'd photograph them, and we keep documentation of that. We'd have a board and identify them and hang that up there. And then contacts over the years, we would put pictures side by side and watch the deterioration of that traffic victim visually, right, over the years through drug abuse, physical abuse, and just the life itself, what it does to them, right? It's reduced because of health issues, drug overdoses, murder, they're killed, suicide. It becomes too much. It becomes too much for them to handle, and they take their own lives, sadly. What are some of the indicators for trafficking? Again, that history of emotional, sexual, and physical abuse. 80 to 90% of traffic survivors have experienced sexual abuse in their past, right? Really important to know. and especially for mental health workers, I think truly that if we could, and I understand that 80 to 90% of sexual assault victims don't report, but if we could intervene, especially mental health wise, earlier on, right, and undercut some of these post-traumatic stress, some of the symptoms of neurobiology of trauma. If we could do that earlier, I think would reduce some. I've had survivors come into my office. A warning, I'm about to drop the F-bomb, it's in a quote. But I've had survivors come into my office and say, what the fuck? Do I have rape me written on my forehead? I was sexually abused as a child. I was sexually assaulted as a teenager. I've been sexually assaulted as a young adult. Do I have sexual rape me written on my forehead? Why is this happening to me? Right? As this trauma happens, it changes the effect of the individual, right? We wear it on our face. Newer studies have found that trauma can actually be passed right through our DNA. Incredible, incredible. But the factors and how it affects our continence and how we walk and how we talk is a flag to a predator, right? It's like seeing a wounded gazelle, right, out in the bush, and the lion attacks that one, right? These predators, these traffickers do the same thing. They're not going to go after that girl that comes up to them in the mall and says, "Hi, my name's Janie. How are you?" No, they're looking for that wounded individual, that outcast, that one that's off from her friends, the one that dresses differently, the one that looks depressed, the one that's obviously suffering, right? Those are the ones that they go after, right? So all of that plays into that. History of running away, we talked about that. 60% more likely to be trafficked. And that happens within the first 48 hours of running away, whether it's at a bus stop, at the mall. It happens very quickly once they run away. Inexplicable appearance of gifts, clothing, other costly items. What is a 13-year-old doing out on the street, right, out on the track, wearing Jimmy Choo shoes, dressed to the nines, jeweled nails, hair fixed up? How's a 12-year-old get money? Yes, I know what Jimmy Choo shoes look like, and I know what they cost. Those aren't hers. She's sharing them with however many other girls that the pimp is running, right? But those are called clues, things that we need to look for. That presence of the older boyfriend or girlfriend, right? Someone that they're looking to, much like the kids on the boats, right? On the trafficking on Lake Volta, they're looking for approval. Can I talk to him, right? And the older person, the boyfriend, the boyfriend is going to be the pimp, right? An older girlfriend. What happens in the trafficking in the life is those that started out being trafficked and prove themselves worthy to the trafficker become something what's called a bottom bitch. The bottom bitch is the one that actually traffics the girls, right? The pimp brings them in, grooms them. The bottom bitch, the girlfriend, teaches them about the life, right, and how to do it, and takes them out, escorts them, where to go, what to say, gives them a script, right? And that becomes difficult too, right? When we do these investigations and we arrest that bottom bitch who herself is a survivor and a trafficking victim, right? But at that time, is she a victim or a perpetrator? Because she's actually pimping out, she's trafficking this other girl, this other boy, right? And it becomes very difficult in those type of circumstances. Drug addiction we talked about, lack of interest in previous activities we talked about, gang involvement. The gangs aren't stupid. The cartels aren't stupid. Sex trafficking became equal, right, on the black market to drugs because of how much money it makes, right? And they're not stupid. They understand that. They understand that exploitation, using that over and over again, right? To get the benefit of the money without having to re-up, like buying drugs or buying guns, right? Signs of physical abuse, we talked about it, won't usually be around the face, be on the torso. Look for tattoos, brands, tattoos, Pimp Daddy Mike with a heart, right? That's called a clue. If you find 4 or 5, 6 girls that have that tattoo, Pimp Daddy Mike, same heart, that's called a clue. They might be all working for the same trafficker. Being arrested once, more than once in a 4-day period. There's different types of sex workers, right? So you have the independent sex worker who's out there, isn't being dominated or put out there by a pimp. If she gets arrested, probably not going to have the money to bond herself out. Even if she does, she's going to lay low for a while, doesn't want to go back. If they're arrested more than once in the 4-day period, somebody's putting them back out there on the street immediately, right? It's all about money. It's all about making money, right? So there's a clue. They all go by different names and don't use IDs. We're used to that in the police department. At one time, I fabricated a warrant, and the name on the warrant was "Who Me?" Because everybody I'd come up to, I'd say, "Hey, I have a warrant for your arrest." And they go, "Who, me?" And I'd take that out and say, "Yeah, look, you, who, me, right here, warrant for your arrest." They never carry identification, use multiple aliases. We're used to that. Do they appear to be disconnected from family and friends? That's the goal, right, of the trafficker. They don't want those relationships. Signs of physical abuse, malnutrition. They live on the Dollar General diet, right? There may be 8 of them sharing a motel room. They're eating Snicker bars and just dump junk for dinner if they eat. We talked about them not beating up the face, brands and tattoos. Has a child stopped going to school? Oftentimes they're in school, right? And they're trafficked on the weekends by their traffickers. And we think of traffickers, right, as this big monster and this stranger. Sometimes it's within their own house, right? Their own uncle, their own mother, their own father is trafficking them. So they're going to school, and then on the weekends they're catching a ride share to the convention center and trafficking, right? Is a juvenile engaged in commercial sex anything of value? Sex trafficking. Disoriented, confused, show signs of mental or physical abuse, timid, fearful, having been denied food and water, deferring to that person controlling everything, either the trafficker or the bottom bitch. Do they appear to be coached on what to say? They'll have a whole backstory memorized, right, and drilled into them by either the bottom bitch or the trafficker about how old they are, where they went to school, and it takes time doing the investigation to erode that away and come to the truth, right? Are they living in unsuitable conditions? 8 girls living in one room, right? Sharing clothes. We're in and out a lot of places, even as social workers, CPS. You know, are the bars on the doors and the windows to keep people out, or are they to keep people in, right? Something that you need to think about. But we don't know what we don't know. And the eye does not see what the brain doesn't know, right? So through awareness, is our best tool. By educating ourselves, going to webinars like this, I'll come out to your organization, I'll train with your people. Information is power, right? The more we know, the better we are to see it. And if we don't know it, if the brain doesn't know, the eye doesn't see. I'm gonna skip over that. Here's some resources. Governor's Child Sex Trafficking Team, Trafficking Prevention Task Force. You do really good, and it's really nice to see the major cities within the state of Texas. I know like Houston, for example, when a hurricane came in the shelters, they were passing out information about trafficking, knowing that people become vulnerable in those situations, right? And that's what the traffickers are after. And they were proactive in putting out information, telling people what to look out for, right? Give you a second to get those if you need that. So it's a socioeconomic problem, like we talked about the kids on the lake, right? Mom would sell the kid for a price of a goat, which in U.S. money was maybe $20, but in Ghana, that $20 would allow her to feed her other children, to put another child in school. And they would do micro loans, they would do job fairs to help these young mothers do something other than selling their children, right? Legal law enforcement. I said I'm on the policy team. There are a plethora of bills coming through right now on human trafficking, and a lot of them are increasing penalties for human trafficking and child sexual assault infractions that come through, increasing those penalties. The more we expose the traffickers, the more we expose the customers, the Johns, it'll lessen, it won't go away, but it'll lessen the frequency, right? And we need to attack those networks, right? The criminal organizations that are doing this, the cartels, the gangs, medium campaigns to support and report what's going on to help deter some of this thing. Another thing that's very helpful in the state of Texas is very good at doing, and so is the federal government. If you're convicted of human trafficking in the state of Texas or by the feds, you can expect up to a life sentence. And in the feds, you're going to do 80% of that time. If it's life, it's life. But if you get a 30-year sentence, you're going to do 80% of that time. Very helpful as a deterrent, right? And the exposure, we need to expose it. And we need that awareness to be able to recognize it. It takes everybody, law enforcement, first responders, our human trafficking task force. They're very complex investigations, right? There's many moving parts. And to put those together, it's very complex. It's very similar to a high profile or a complex drug investigation, right? There's many spokes of the wheel that we can use to put them away. But we need our aftercare, our healthcare. Talked about mental health. Man, I'm telling you, and I know that the mental health industry is so understaffed, but it's critical that we get to these young survivors and shortcut this post-traumatic stress and the neurobiology trauma that takes effect, because that's what these traffickers are focusing on. They're doing behavior analysis, they're profilers, and that's what they're looking for, right? So if we can help that, educating our educators, admin, Title IX, teachers, coaches, all staff, educating our prosecutors, judges, and our legislators, right? We do that. Many occasions I have had prosecutors, a few occasions I've had judges come to some of my trainings. Legislators, we go to the Capitol, we educate them on the effects of trauma, how trauma relates to trafficking, how trafficking works, so that they can better be informed to put these laws forward, right, that we need. So congratulations, right? Y'all are here. You're doing your due diligence, and it can only help, right? The more we know, the more we see. So thank you. Thank you for being here. If you would be so kind, I don't know if Crystal also has this, but if you would take your phones out, this QR code, it's an evaluation survey. All of our trainings, we're supplied by grants, right? And we have deliverables, and you know how that works. Most of you know how that works. So if you would be so kind as to be kind and do this survey, it helps us tremendously. I can tell you TASA and our training section and myself when I come out and I train. TASA provides everything. If you can put 20 people together and a place for us to come meet you, we travel and come and train you as well. If you'd like that, please contact me or contact Crystal. She can send you out. We have a wide range of trainings that we do on sexual assault and sexual assault prevention, wellness, self-care for providers, for law enforcement. I know you don't think you need it, but you do. And advocates as well, right? This is a tough, nasty, nasty job, and it gets us too, right? So we need those services as well from time to time. So if you'd be so kind as to do that, I've left that up long enough, I hope. There's my information on the bottom, contact information. Please feel free. Far and away, the best way to get a hold of me is to contact me by email, and I will get back to you. This is a little different, this presentation. The one that I submitted to you, Crystal, was a much shorter version because I didn't think I had this much time. But if you all need a copy of the longer version, or if you'd like me to come out to your organization, I would be more than happy to do that. And with that, I left you, almost 30 minutes. I was almost on time, Crystal.
We actually have a few questions from the audience for you, Mike. So,
Great.
the big question that somebody wanted to know was, do you know of any adverse childhood studies that have been done with human trafficking survivors and any of the outcomes of those?
I don't, out of my realm, but other than they're cited in different studies, the CCRC, that poly-victimization study, that early victimhood starts that process, right, of post-traumatic stress and neurobiology trauma. Just knowing that, seeing the effects of that, is what drives those predators to that individual, right? That's why the victimology, the study of the victim, is so important, right? In homicides, the victim can't speak, but by studying the victim, it tells us a lot about the perpetrator. Same thing in trafficking. The more I can learn about childhood trauma, neurobiology of trauma, post-traumatic stress syndrome, how it affects the survivors, it tells me so much more about the predator, right? That I can start targeting and looking for, and helps me in interviews, interrogations, helps you as an advocate better provide service to that individual as well. I don't know if I answered your question, but go ahead, Chris.
All right. And then another question that was pre-submitted for us today. People were looking for resources. Do you know any specific information about the prevalence of human trafficking in South Texas or any unique risks for that part of the state? And then what can we be teaching students in that area?
Sure. So that slide I had on the state of Texas, that UT study, is the most recent and competent study on human trafficking that covers the whole state. Unique about our southern border is it's an entry point, right? Even Customs, Border Patrol kind of get confused about what's smuggling and what's trafficking, right? Smuggling is a crime against the country, crime against whatever state they enter into, right? Human trafficking is a crime against human, right? Not a crime against the state, not a crime against the country. But oftentimes what happens in that journey, right, they contract with a coyote, a person, to bring them across the border. And they're paid a lot of money, $8,000-$10,000 to get them from one country into the United States. But along that journey, they're sexually assaulted, they're exploited. Once they get here, the situation changes. And say I said it was going to cost you $8,000, Now it costs you 20,000. And for you, I'm gonna blackmail your family. I'm gonna go after your family to get that money, and you are gonna work it off. You're gonna go to my cantinas and you're gonna be a sex slave and you're gonna work off that $20,000, which never happens, right? That money is never repaid. But that's some of the exploitation that goes on right there on the border. Some of the safe houses that have been set up aren't so safe, right? They exploit the immigrants as they come across sexually for labor as well. Any way they can exploit them, they'll exploit them.
Let me just double check the chat. I know it's the chat box is moving really fast. Let's
I can
see.
pull it up too as well now, I think.
All right. And then I know that the other question that was pre-submitted is there's a lot of false resources out there that people may be getting with social media, organizations popping up that may not be trained in this particular area, but kind of wanting to put information out. So how do people know what's reliable information about human trafficking and then what might be based in fear or myths about human trafficking?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest myths, you see advertisements and the girls in chains and behind bars and in cages. That's really not the fact, right? It's done on a personal level, again, by someone you know, trust, maybe even love, that do you the most damage, right? Do those kidnapping, abduction type thing happen? They do, but they're rare. They're rare that they happen. So I those kind of things kind of bother me, and I shy away from them. I'd stay. I can't believe I'm saying this, but more towards government sources like the Human Trafficking Task Force. Every area, like in your SARTs areas, counties will have a human trafficking person that's either on the task force or a liaison to the task force, and I would use them. As far as like NGOs, that there's several of them out there. I can send a list of those to you or give a list to Crystal to send out with any other announcements that are very good as well. I can get those out to you. Yeah, there's a lot. They pop up all the time. And then fortunately, like foster homes, right? They're not always honorable. We found that in Africa as well, right? They came forward as good, loving people just wanting to help. And by the time they got the children, they damaged the children, abused, exploited the children as well. So it's very careful that you vet whoever you choose, look at their history, look at their ratings, uh, and go through that. I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head. I'll get that. It's better if I get a list to y'all and give you the reputable organizations, and they're nationwide as well, that you can go through, and that they also can direct you, as can the Texas Human Trafficking Task Force. They can direct you as well.
Then let's see. Those are all the pre-submitted questions, but yeah, I definitely agree, Mike. That's one thing I've been seeing a lot. A lot of people, have you seen this movie? Have you seen that? Have you done this? And I'm like, watch your sources, like really investigate what makes it credible, because this is already such a scary thing. And then somebody saw something at Walmart and it goes viral and it's like, well, that's not actually how human trafficking always works, right? It's
It's
usually
an
somebody you know or you love.
exploitation. It's an exploitation in itself,
Yeah.
right? They they're in it for the money, the irreputable ones, and they're sowing fear, and they're bringing people in and raking in donations and they themselves are exploiting our survivors of sex trafficking. And it's tragic, but it happens. But it happens in foster care and foster homes. It's nothing new.
Right.
We just have to, I'm glad that you asked the question. That means you're thinking about it. So, yeah, vet any information you get, vet it. You've got my contact information. Feel free to contact me, the state, and I'll get a list of folks for you.
All right. Yep. All right. And let's see. I think we are getting close to wrapping up. We can send out some information about how to contact TASA for training opportunities. That's on our website, tasa.org/training. Join us next month on February 21st. We are going to have a guest speaker from the Iowa Coalition and the Resource Sharing Project, which are two phenomenal organizations in and of themselves who will be talking about rural issues. So I'm really looking forward to having Lachey join us next month, all the way from Iowa. Mike's list will be in our follow-up email, along with the training slides and the link to the recording and the certificate of completion that is also the CEU certificate. So thanks again for joining us. Like I said, this session was recorded for our YouTube channel, so feel free to follow us and rewatch, or keep a lookout on your email to join us next month. And then after Lachey presents for us, we will be working with Men Healing to do a 3-part series on male survivors. So those sessions will be offered in part of February and part of March. So definitely keep following us to register for those. If you are someone who's working with male survivors, who is working with incarcerated male survivors, or partners of male survivors, there will be specific sessions that you may be interested in participating in. Those email registration links go out via our communications list. So if you're not on that list and you want to get on, just send me an email and we can make that happen. So, all right, y'all, I think that concludes today's session. Thanks again to Peggy for helping out with the chat and Mike for being our guest speaker, and we will see you guys next month.